The experience is as old as time. No human being has ever escaped this common occurrence. At some point in our lives, we all win and lose arguments. And in our world today, it seems that arguing and winning and losing is a national pastime. Just listen to the news tonight and you will eventually hear who won and who lost the arguments today. As a pastor who has served the church for over 3 decades, much of it during what many scholars call a postmodern shift of thought and competing philosophies, I know what it's like to lose an argument or two. In fact, my best illustrations of this are the many conversations I have had over the years with friends of mine who have also grown up in the church. But these days, more and more of those friends say things like, "I'm not sure about the church's teaching anymore, Richard," or even about Jesus for that matter. I have one friend who is constantly obsessed with relevance. He says to me, "You talk about Jesus and tell stories I have heard over and over again, but I know those stories and pretty much where you're going when you begin telling them. But I find myself waiting to hear a new word, a word that is relevant, even just a thought that will challenge me and the world I see around me." Friends, we live and learn and preach in a time where the questions of relevance are most compelling in a postmodern context. The scripture story just read, and hopefully the sermon I'm about to preach, will illustrate the timeless relevance that lies in the heart of Scripture, especially regarding issues we cannot seem to shake or even fully understand or transcend. Those issues are buried in this story, and I believe they are there to remind us of the work still left for us to do. It really is a scandalous story, this one about the conversation between Jesus and an unnamed Syrophoenician woman. The context and the place in which this conversation takes place is interesting to note. The scripture says, "From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there." Now, if you remember any of your Sunday school geography lessons, you might remember that the city of Tyre lies on the coastline of the Holy Land. So Jesus enters a house at the beach to get away from everyone. To the beach, to get away from it all. We understand that. Mark even tells us why. In previous stories in Mark's gospel, Jesus has completed his famous encounter where he walks on water and then rebukes his disciples for their lack of faith. Immediately following that lesson with his disciples, Jesus is put to the test with some Pharisees who raise issues of controversy over purification rules. So when Jesus sets out to the beach house on the shore near Tyre, we know he's tired, he's spent. He wants to be left alone. The writer of Mark's gospel tells us as much. But the writer of Mark also reminds us of one little detail. He could not escape notice. You see, Jesus continued to attract huge crowds because of his healing powers. And now this unnamed Syrophoenician woman finds him and she begs Jesus to heal her daughter. And the response Jesus gives has caused chills to run down the backs of many a scholar and countless preachers. Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first," which meant the children of Israel. "For it is not fair to take the children's food and feed it to the dogs." And most scholars and preachers believe that this is Jesus in his most raw humanity speaking here. He's tired and spent, needing to get away. He just cannot quite shake the problems of the needy, and in his tired, frustrated human body, mind, and spirit, He tries to draw a boundary line. Awkwardly, he tries to convey his mission to this unnamed Greek Syrophoenician woman. In essence, he says that she does not belong to the people he came to preach to or heal. Even worse, in his raw humanity, he likens this woman and her kind to being dogs. I shared this insight with one of my friends I mentioned earlier, the one who struggles with relevance, who also grew up in the church. He told me he had not remembered this story in Jesus' life and ministry. And he said to me, even if he had remembered, he would not have understood what Jesus was talking about when he likened her to a dog. And so we got into some explaining, and then we struggled together over what this might mean. It is certainly not the predominant image we have of Jesus in his life and ministry. We struggled, I suppose, with what every honest Christian at one time or another struggles with. What do you do with the humanity of Jesus? In an article from Christianity Today, way back in 1997, it highlights the emotions of Jesus and why we need to experience them. I like that article. This was what was written. The gospel writers paint their portraits of Jesus using a kaleidoscope of emotional colors. Jesus felt compassion. He was angry, indignant, consumed with zeal. He was troubled, greatly distressed, very sorrowful. He was at other times depressed and deeply moved, and he grieved. He sighed, he wept, he sobbed. He groaned, he was in agony. He was also surprised and amazed. At other times he was full of joy. He greatly desired, he deeply loved. And in our quest to be like Jesus, we often overlook his human emotions. I cannot think of anything more relevant for us to wrestle with today than to first be surprised that it was Jesus who likened a woman to a dog in this ancient story. When we read that story, we cannot help but recognize that in our own humanity, we have not come very far from allowing ourselves to be shaped by a culture of name-calling or marginalizing either individual people or groups, or allowing human prejudices to be just let loose. So during this struggling conversation with my friend, he said to me, "Do you think Jesus really said this?" Which I interpret him as asking, can I really trust and learn from Jesus and his humanity when it is so much like my own? And if that is the question, then I think the answer is yes. Yes, we can trust and learn, but I also think it's a qualified yes, because as I pointed out to my friend, the conversation between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, it's not over yet. And so we continued on with the scripture in front of us. We noticed the scripture records how the woman responded. She said, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She actually uses the same term dogs, but it turns it on its side and dispenses with it. She really didn't take offense to what Jesus said. In that 11-word answer, Jesus loses his argument. And we know he lost his argument because Jesus immediately responds by saying, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." This woman, you see, is a master of argument beyond any disciple Jesus has met up to this point. She actually hears this term dog that Jesus uses, and hears it as unimportant and ambiguous because she knows Jesus is the one who has the power to heal her daughter. And that's all she cares about. That is all she came seeking. And so when Jesus hears that answer of hers, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs," Jesus knows that she is not appealing to his mission or for whom he came to give the good news to first. She is appealing to his God-given power to heal. And what really happens in that moment when Jesus responds by saying, "For saying that, you may go, the demon has left your daughter," what really happens here is that the humanity of Jesus, in all of its tiredness and needing to withdraw, it just falls away. And what is left is Christ. The Christ we all know, who came to heal and to bind up the broken. That's who shows up in the end. Now, friends, there are 3 relevant insights for us to wrestle with from this ancient story. The first insight is given to any of us who are in positions of authority and power. Jesus himself teaches us how to lose an argument. First, he recognizes this woman's argument goes much deeper than his own. And then in granting her request, he demonstrates grace at its deepest and most divine levels. Let's face it, in our humanity, we're not nearly as gracious, are we? And so perhaps from Jesus, we can learn grace and how to lose an argument. The second insight is even more relevant, I think, than the first. At face value, we could end this story and think that the crescendo moment is when the woman goes home and finds her child lying on the bed, the demon gone, and the daughter fully restored. The healing would then be the miracle of the story. And that healing is amazing, and it is so gracious. However, the real miracle is not a healing from a distance that Jesus commands and makes good on. The real miracle is the overcoming of prejudice and boundaries that separate people one from another. That's the real miracle in this story. And it is a miracle we are still waiting to see and experience in our stories and in our very lives today. The overcoming of prejudice and boundaries that separate persons one from another. Friends, I don't think we can get any more relevant than that. But there's also a third insight buried in this story. And it has something to do with my friend's struggle, and perhaps my own too, to understand what scholars for centuries have struggled to understand. We wonder, why did the early gospel writers include this story? Here it is in Mark, but it is also found in Matthew's gospel too, where the children are represented as the Jews and the dogs are represented as the Gentiles. Why keep that story with so much of Jesus' humanity just hanging out there, putting down differences in groups of people? I think the few stories in Scripture like this one, where Jesus' humanity shows through more clearly than his divinity, they actually help us. Because in the end of each of those stories, it is Christ who shows up. The Christ that we all know, who came to heal and bind up the broken, no matter who they might be, no matter what they may have done. That's who shows up in the end. As I close this reflection today, I must admit I secretly yearn for a slightly different ending to this story. It is a biblical ending we see at the end of one of Jesus' parables. That simple 4-word response: go and do likewise. Now, at the end of this story, those 4 words are not there. But I would like to believe that they are implied, and we just haven't thought of that implication yet. Go and do likewise. Go and learn how to lose those arguments, especially the ones that try to hide your prejudices. Go. Go and do likewise. Friends, I don't think we can get any more relevant today than that.